Everyone. Thanks very much for having me. We're thrilled to be here, and I'm very happy and fortunate to be presenting with my colleague and friend Larry Roth, who's joining us today from Phoenix, Arizona. I work with ESA, and I've been working on flood risk management issues for about the last 9 years, but today we'll be talking about some of the work that we did over the last 4 years when I worked with Larry at Arcadis. As a real quick plug, I am the co-chair for the ASFPM's Training and Outreach Committee, which focuses a lot on risk and risk communication issues. So there's a sort of a plug for that committee. We're always looking for more folks to get involved. And in advance of Flood Preparedness Week for California, which starts next week, we hope that you enjoy our presentation. Briefly, today's discussion, we're going to start off with defining what is risk so that we start with a common definition and understanding. Then we'll be talking about U.S. flood policy and the sort of levels of protection approach. Then talking about tolerable risk guidelines, how we use risk analysis, and then how we applied it to a case study in the California Delta. We'll finish off with some other applications of it and a question for your CFM CEC credits. So do pay attention. So I'll pass it to Larry.
Thanks, Jessica. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Watershed University for giving us a chance to do this. I'm the mystery presenter today. You'll have to watch Jessica, and her facial expressions will tell you how I'm doing. Let's go to we got to decide what risk is. Normally, risk is a pretty overused term. It generally means something bad is going to happen, but in this presentation today we're going to be talking about a very precise definition of risk. Generally, when we talk about flood risk management, we focus on the hazard. What is the hazard and how likely it is to occur, and if we're looking at levee accreditation, FEMA 446510 asks us to determine how the infrastructure, in this case a levee, will perform. But when we talk about risk, we really need to add one more set of factors to our discussion, and that's who and what are in harm's way, and if there's an adverse event, in this case flooding, how much harm will be caused. So risk is very simply defined as the probability of an adverse event times the consequences of that event should it occur. Generally, in flood risk management, we focus on the hazard. That is the probability that a flood may occur. But when we move to a risk discussion, we want to bring the consequences into our equation. As you well know, risk cannot be ignored. Every time Jessica and I make this presentation, we have to update with photos and new dates, but just over the past decade there have been some dramatic flooding events, and what we've seen in Houston over the last several years is a very dramatic case of how flooding can really disrupt everything that we're trying to accomplish. We measure risk in a couple of ways. Often we use expected annual fatalities as a measure of risk. And when we calculate EAF, we have to consider the probability of flooding. We look at the number of individuals that would be exposed to flood water. And certainly we need to take into account many factors such as warning time, the depth of water that could be expected, its velocity, rate of rise, and here in California we have to pay real strong attention to the temperature of the water as well. We also measure risk in expected annual damages, and this is the damage to property and to infrastructure that may occur as a result of flooding. So we again have to understand the probability, but then we can use depth damage curve and integrate these over all flood levels to determine what the expected annual damages may be from flood risk. The ability to quantify risk offers many advantages. Importantly, it helps facilitate us to both understand and to better communicate risk. It tells us, as you'll see later in this presentation, where risks are the greatest, and it can be informative on what actions we should take to reduce risks. But very importantly in this discussion, we also have to decide what risks are tolerable. Is more risk reduction warranted?
All right. From the top, William Hammond Hall is one of California's sort of first known licensed engineers, and he's famous for saying that when it comes to levees, there are two types. There are those that have been overtopped by floodwaters, and you know what comes next because you've already seen the slide. Those that will be overtopped by floodwaters, and this is an important piece to that, which is that we have to expect that floods will occasionally come, which have to be allowed to spread out. And then you sort of follow and think, so long as there is something in that floodplain that could be flooded, then we have a risk that we can't ignore. For an oversimplification of U.S. flood policy, let's take a look at these two communities. The National Flood Insurance Program began around 1968 as a way to reduce federal losses and disaster liability. We had previously had a cycle of major floods and hurricane, and the federal government swooping in and rebuilding, and then more floods. And so we were looking for a way to reduce this cycle. One of the intents was also to identify floodplains and ideally discourage development therein. And to offer flood insurance to those who were unable to acquire it due to a process called adverse selection. It has three components that many of you are probably familiar with. The first is floodplain mapping. Second is floodplain management, and this involves a lot of building requirements and a flood insurance program. It's based mostly on the 1% flood, or what we often refer to as the 100-year level protection, and it is what underscores 44 Code of Federal Regulations 6510. And what this basically says, the 1% level protection approach, is we're going to do H&H models to identify the depth and the extent of the 1% annual chance flood and mark that out in the landscape. And if your property falls within that area, you're considered in the floodplain. In theory, there was intended to be no new development. Insurance is required in these areas, and then you have floodplain management requirements like floodproofing or elevation, for example. If you are out of the floodplain or behind an accredited levee, there is no insurance required, no building requirements either. So, Larry explained how we measure risk. How do we measure sort of achieving 1% level of protection? Well, we say how high is that base flood elevation, that 1% flood, and then if we have a levee that's met for 6510, then we have 1% level of protection, and if we don't, or if we're not outside of the regulatory floodplain, then we do not have a 1% level of protection. But this, as the way the program is set up, does not tell us anything about risk or residual risk, and it, again, focuses on that hazard, and in doing so can imply that risk can be eliminated. So what is that 100-year flood anyway? It's defined as the flood with a 1% or 1 in 100 chance of occurring or being exceeded in any year. Here are some other definitions. The last flood came in 1950. I guess the next one will be in 2050. It's a major flood that comes every 100 years. It's really a worst case scenario. And the Army Corps of Engineers built our levees to last 100 years. So these are real answers from a 2009 survey that I did in 2009 in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta area in a neighborhood that was protected by an accredited levee. Using the level protection approach ignores residual risk. Residual risk can be defined as the flood risk that remains after you've taken actions to reduce that risk. So consider these two houses and this water level. The house on the right has lower residual risk than the house on the left. Let's imagine that the water level rises 2 or 3 feet. If you're in that house on the right, you're seeing the rain and the water level slowly rise up. Presumably you've got time to move your valuables out of the way or to a second floor. You can evacuate. And if you're in a special flood hazard area, presumably you've got some insurance and maybe you've done some mitigation or floodproofing already, so hopefully your damages are low. Now let's consider that same 2 to 3 foot water level rise for the house that's on the left. And then what we're talking about is a possible or likely levee failure. And levees don't tend to fail slowly, the way that water can rise on the right side of this picture slowly. They tend to fail catastrophically. And if this is an accredited levee, then presumably the house behind it does not have any flood insurance or does not have floodproofing or mitigation actions taken. And the greater results of that survey I referenced before showed that folks living behind accredited levees were not aware of flood risk. Ignoring residual risk has adverse consequences on overall public safety, on land use decisions, because often our land use planners and our builders and our architects are really just complying with what's required of them, but nothing is required of them in a flood sense behind accredited levees or even just outside that 1% floodplain. It also has adverse consequences on infrastructure investment, where and how high to build, and on preparedness, both from an individual preparedness perspective, but also for our utilities, other power systems, critical facilities, and infrastructures. Other limitations of the level of protection approach, you might want to pay attention to this slide, are that the 1% approach was developed to be an insurance standard. It was not developed as a safety standard. So I just want to repeat that. It wasn't developed based on experts, scientists, stakeholders all together in a room weighing the pros and the cons and saying, this is safe enough to me. It was set for insurance purposes. Another limitation of this level of protection approach is that it focuses on the hazard, and in doing so we ignore the discussion on consequences, and we imply that risk can be eliminated. This approach also tends to favor structural solutions like levees and flood walls because it ends up being really the only way that you can get out of your flood insurance mandatory requirements. And in addition, as we saw before, it becomes hard to measure risk reduction that you're getting or cost effectiveness that you're getting if all you're measuring really is that water level of the 1%, as opposed to measuring the damage and life safety issues. So finally, this level of protection approach, where we're really just seeking that 1% level of protection, it prevents that discussion of how safe is safe enough. So is there a better approach, you ask? Well, yes, we do have guidance from other settings. We're going to explain tolerable risk in a moment, and there are other industries out there, the nuclear safety and aviation safety, dam safety, and other hazardous occupations, all utilize a tolerable risk and risk-informed decision-making approach. This is Larry.
So we're going to talk to a little bit now about tolerable risk guidelines. And what we have to keep in mind here is what Jessica just presented and described as residual risk. There is always going to be risk with us, and it can't be eliminated. We have to live with the residual risk. So the question becomes, well, what level of risk is tolerable? What level of risk, residual risk, can we accept? And clearly the picture on the left, where we have agricultural lands with low consequences from flooding, the level of residual risk we can tolerate there is probably much greater than in the photograph on the right, where we have homes built right up against the levee. This is really an interesting example from the recent flooding in Houston. We often don't think about consequences that go beyond normal kinds of flood damage, things getting wet. But you may recall there was a chemical plant in Houston that lost power due to the flood. The power then caused the cooling system to fail, and the chemicals that were stored there had to be kept cool or they would spontaneously combust or explode. And in fact, this became a very severe consequences of the flooding in Houston. That leads us to, well, what level of risk again is tolerable, and to do that we wanted to define tolerable risk, and that is the level of risk that people are willing to live with in order to secure certain benefits. And we have to understand and accept that there isn't a single answer to tolerable risk. It depends on the situation, and they go from broadly unacceptable risks to those risks that are broadly acceptable. We drive in our cars every day. There is risk associated with it, but we accept and tolerate that level of risk. So we're actually generally familiar with this because we make risk decisions every day on things around us. We choose the level of insurance that we want, and we also choose the level of deductibles that we might want to live with. And this is insurance that may apply to our homes, to our automobiles, to our lives. When we get in our car, we can make a conscious decision to either put our seatbelt on or leave it off and risk that we might be in a serious accident or that we might get a ticket for not wearing our seatbelts. And of course, we're all familiar with being offered product protection plans, and we all make a decision whether to accept those and pay the extra amount or not. So the principles of tolerable risk are really quite simple. The first is that life safety is paramount. So our decisions on risk should fundamentally be based on life safety. We also have to recognize that risk cannot be ignored. There will always be residual risk, and also that absolute safety cannot be guaranteed. And when we look at deciding on levels of tolerable risk, we can take into account issues like equity and efficiency. Our goal ought to be ALARP, a term that you may have heard, which is as low as reasonably practicable. That is, we want to make investments that are as low as reasonably practicable to get the risks to levels, the residual risk to levels that we can tolerate.
Sounds on. Okay. So how do you use risk analysis and tolerable risk guidelines? Sort of a pretty simplified process that we have up here is your first step is to characterize and estimate risk and uncertainty. So to do that, you need to look at what are all of your hazards and what's the probability of flooding. Then you're going to take an inventory of all your possible consequences. And typically, we look at property and infrastructure, but recently life safety. And then if you look to the example that Larry drew earlier, we can integrate those additional types of consequences of flooding of petrochemical plants or critical facilities and such. And then you're also going to recognize that there is uncertainty in all of these estimates, so you need to be transparent about where the uncertainty is. Then after you've identified your risk, you're going to identify options to reduce that risk. So you can look at structural options. We can also look at non-structural options and those nature-based options. And so rather than just thinking about dams, levees, and flood walls, here we can also consider non-structural like elevation, floodproofing, land use, all different types of evacuation measures, flood risk awareness campaigns, etc. So we look at all of those and then we evaluate those options. So first we can, since we've already quantified risk, we could effectively quantify how much do each of these measures reduce that risk, and then, how much do these measures reduce that risk? Is the residual risk that remains considered tolerable? How expensive are these measures? How cost effective are these measures? And then we look at the trade-offs of implementing each of these measures. And then finally, we are going to implement these options and then continuously review and assess our risk over time as conditions change, whether we're talking about the quality of our infrastructure may be degrading, or whether we're talking about things like increased precipitation or sea level rise. So you want to continuously review those risks. I did see in the midst of this that a quick question came in asking how common the acronyms that we're using in here are, and if there is a reference list somewhere. You know, I just realized we used to have a glossary and an acronym list at the last slide of this presentation, which we can provide later on. I would say that probably the levels of protection approach we shortened to save space on slides, and maybe same thing with tolerable risk guidelines, but otherwise I think things like the NFIP are fairly common, and hopefully that answers your question. So for a quick recap, the process generally is to use risk analysis to inform your decision making is to assess and quantify your risks, to identify the uncertainties, and you can look at where risks are the greatest. Then you're going to look at all your options that are available to you to reduce risk. Then you're going to evaluate those options for how well they reduce risk and whether they reduce risk to tolerable levels, and look at their trade-offs. And then you're going to implement those options and continue to review your risk as conditions change. There is precedent for this in the United Kingdom. Some work we're showing that H.R. Wallingford did. The UK has done a national assessment, so what you're looking at is a map of expected annual damages on the Humber River estuary, and they use this to prioritize investments nationally. In the Netherlands, they are well known for sort of sound flood risk management and prowess of civil engineering, and they have shifted over probably the last 5 years or so from a more level of protection approach where they just said, never again will we experience our large floods. We want to keep the water out at all costs. And they've shifted to a more risk-informed approach. So what you're looking at is a map of the Netherlands with their new flood safety standards. What they did in 2014 was, instead of having a level of protection standard where it used to say no greater than 1 in 10,000 chance of flooding, they shifted to an individual life risk safety standard. So what they now say is no Dutch person should have greater than a 1 in 100,000 chance per year of dying from a flood. So if you look, there's a probability, the 1 in 100,000 chance, and the consequence is dying from a flood. And that's how they've shifted their approach. So it's an EAF of 1 in 100,000. They also then added a societal risk safety standard. So in areas like the Randstad, which is Amsterdam, Rotterdam area where you have lots of economic activity and 9 million people, they have even higher standards. They then use a risk analysis to determine their levee heights throughout the country. So in areas where it's more rural agricultural land, they have lower dike heights required. And then you have this new move to a risk-informed, what they call multi-layered safety. So where they can't economically justify really high dikes and levees, they then use what they call safety layer 2 and 3, which are sort of land use planning, non-structural, elevation evacuation, crisis response. And the way that they do that, since they are using risk as this metric, they can say, all right, how can we meet that life safety standard? So one way would be to build a levee that protects against the 1 in 100,000 year flood. Another way might be to say, well, let's have a smaller levee that protects to a 1 in 10,000 year flood, but let's also add on some non-structural measures like vertical evacuation or some land use planning, maybe flood proofing, to increase that safety by another factor of 10%. So using the risk standard really gives you flexibility in meeting the standard. We do have precedents for this in the United States. The Bureau and the Army Corps have been using it for dams for a number of years, and the Army Corps has begun to use the tolerable risk for levee design and construction. We asked the question, how safe is safe enough? And as Larry mentioned earlier, it's not going to be a solid number, but it is a decision that will need to be informed by analysis and by a risk assessment, understanding your probability and your consequences, and it needs to be a policy decision with stakeholders and experts involved. And when you set this limit or this range, you have to consider individual risks, so risk to me, my property, sort of my day-to-day, my family, and societal risks, areas where we could have sort of mass casualty or large disruption to a lot of people, and then also consider issues of equity in this determination. We'll shift this over to Larry to talk about the case study of applying this concept in the California Delta.
Yeah, so let's, thanks Jess, let's bring it home and talk about something that's real near to us in the Sacramento area. You're all familiar with the Delta, which is really the low point, where the Delta watershed, all of the rivers in the Delta watershed drain ultimately to the Delta, and the Delta is an incredibly important part of the California landscape. Next slide. Thanks. The Delta is characterized by 1,100 miles of levees. There's over 60 major islands, and in our study you'll see we had in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh about 170 separate hydrologic units or polders. The Delta is very important to California and California economy. 27 million people get some or all of their water from the Delta, and the Delta also helps irrigate over 3 million acres of irrigated land in California. The ecosystem of the Delta is dependent on the health of Delta waterways. And within the Delta itself, we have an extensive agricultural economy, and it's also home to over 500,000 people. The levees, we know, are critical to the state's water supply. Really two important functions, actually three, which you'll see. One is to impede brackish water from entering the Delta from San Francisco and San Pablo Bay, and they also provide the freshwater path across the Delta to get water in the Sacramento River to the pumps, which sends the water to Southern California. In our study, we identified three major water supply functions that we need to characterize, and we identified those islands that are important for those functions. The first function is water quality, which is really the reduction of salinity intrusion, and you all may be familiar that the 8 western islands in the Delta really serve as that cork in the bottle function and preserve water quality within the central and eastern parts of the Delta. A second function that the levees provide is that freshwater corridor from the Sacramento to the pumps at the southwestern end of the Delta. And the islands are also home to many important water supply infrastructure facilities, including pump stations and aqueducts. So the levees within the Delta are very important to California's water supply. We also recognize that the ecosystem is really important, and if we visit the pre-1800s Delta before European settlers arrived, the Delta was over 500 square miles of freshwater wetlands and 380 square miles of tidal marsh. It was the home to over 500 species of fish and wildlife, and has been often characterized as the American Serengeti. But with the advent of creating levees throughout the Delta and beginning to aggressively farm the Delta area, the combination of consolidation and wind erosion and decomposition has caused the organic soils to subside, and in the western part of the Delta now, many of the islands are up to 15 feet or more below sea level, as indicated on this map. So we recognize that, have to recognize that Delta levees, which were built for one purpose, now serve another, built for really agriculture and transportation, but now are protecting homes and families. The Delta is prone to many flood risk hazards. We certainly have flooding from hydraulic flood events in the watershed. We have the possibility of large earthquakes to the west of the Delta in the San Francisco Bay Area. Most of the levees in the Delta were constructed before modern engineering practices, and they're really legacy structures that are in various degrees of condition, and they're prone to subsidence, and also there's a potential for seepage-related failures. And in fact, there have been 158 documented levee failures in the past century. And of course, these flood hazards create many adverse consequences, flooding of homes and farms. They imperil, in some cases, the ecosystem, and they certainly imperil the water supply for California. So as a result of the importance of the Delta, in 2009, the legislature created the Delta Reform Act, and the Delta Reform Act promulgates the co-equal goals. One, to provide a more reliable water supply for California while protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta ecosystem, and both of those goals are to be met while protecting and enhancing the Delta itself as an evolving place. And so these co-equal goals actually help define what the state's interest could be in improving those Delta levees. And as a result of the Delta Reform Act, the Delta Stewardship Council was charged with recommending priorities for state investments in Delta levees to reduce flood risk and to help advance those co-equal goals. And we recently completed a study for the Delta Stewardship Council, and to answer many of the questions that were posed regarding acronyms and where it's been used, I would direct your attention to the report that's illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide. You can download that report from the Delta Stewardship Council website. It's the Delta Levees Investment Strategy, and I think it will provide a really in-depth background to the presentation that Jessica and I are making for you today. In this project, we had a simple scope of work, and that was to identify priorities. Those are investment priorities, and the appropriate level of protection for each island. And to assign those priorities, we had to help determine what level of risk is tolerable to key stakeholders, and with that, the stakeholders can determine which levees are most important to improve first. We measured risk in the Delta using 5 metrics. I described earlier expected annual damages and expected annual fatalities. But we also created 3 unique metrics for this particular study. One was regarding water supply disruption, the risk associated with water supply. We also looked at the risk of harm to the Delta ecosystem and the risk of harm to Delta as a place. The results, which you can see again in that report that I referenced, includes a review of the probability of flooding throughout the Delta. This particular map shows both the risks, or the probabilities, the probabilities of flooding due to both hydrologic events, flood events, and also due to earthquake events. And in the report, those are also presented separately, so you can see the earthquake hazard as separate from the hydraulic hazard. But to develop those, we use stage recurrence curves, seismic recurrence curves, and of course we had to understand the performance of the levee through levee fragility curves. With the probability of flooding, we could determine the expected annual fatalities throughout the Delta. And this map indicates where EAF is measured, and it's probably no surprise that expected annual fatalities are highest along the eastern margin of the Delta. That's where most of the population resides, in the greater Sacramento and Stockton areas. But this shows what those expected annual fatalities could be, and it's an indicator then for selecting what the appropriate tolerable risk to life loss we might want to accept. Similarly, we looked at expected annual damages, and also this tends to follow population base. There's more people, homes, and businesses where the population is greatest, but also important in the Delta is both the agriculture, so we took into account crop values, but also the water supply infrastructure. And so many of the islands towards the west, the Delta, have water supply infrastructure that's particularly important. And it looks like we've lost our screen again.
One moment.
I can still hear Larry, though.
This is clearly not an indication of how mystical tolerable risk is. And during the pause, I would again direct you to the Delta Stewardship Council website for there's two reports. One is an in-depth discussion of the risk analysis methodology, and then how that risk analysis methodology was applied. So how do we combine all of those different metrics to come up with a composite risk? And this is really a kind of a cartoon that indicates we essentially layered the risk maps that were resulted from expected annual fatalities, expected annual damages, the risk to water supply disruption, ecosystem harm, and the risk to Delta as a place. We actually built a small decision support software system that enabled us to combine and evaluate and mix the risk to determine or to recommend to the council the kinds of risk that would be that we should be using to guide investments in the Delta. And this is the risk map that results. The red is those islands that present the highest risk to those factors that were considered to be most important. The green are medium risk, and the sort of the gray blue are the lowest risk. This is a combination, but in keeping with the spirit of the earlier slides, this recognizes that life risk is the most important, is paramount in the Delta. So those islands that are in red do incorporate those islands with the highest risk to life. But also other factors are important, and so islands in red towards the western part of the Delta are indicative of the risk to water supply as a specific example. So we identified the high-risk islands, and this will enable the state to set its priorities for the kinds of investments it wants to make in support of levee repairs and maintenance within the Delta. Our report also discusses non-structural measures that could be used, particularly as an example, the particular need for early warning systems in the event of an earthquake, because the earthquake and the potential flooding may come with little or very no warning at all. But this is an open and transparent process. It involved all the stakeholders, including Delta residents, and of interest, no one objected or criticized to this ranking of priorities based on risk, which was, I think, really a testament to the detail that the council went to obtain feedback from all important stakeholders, and especially Delta residents. And then this is currently serving as the basis for amending the policies and recommendations in the Delta plan.
Thanks, Larry. So in just the last couple minutes closing up, we want to revisit the advantages of a tolerable risk or risk-informed approach to decisions around flood risk management. The first is that it communicates risk clearly, because instead of just talking about a water level, we're talking about the probability of flooding and potential consequences. It enables a discussion of really how safe is safe enough, and that discussion should happen when we're making these sorts of decisions. It helps you identify priorities and what to do first, right? Because time and financial resources are limited. We can't do everything all at once, so where are we going to start? A risk-informed approach enables us sort of an equal playing field to evaluate from the full suite of measures. Again, we're not just seeking to pass that 1% flood. We can actually say, well, how much risk do these measures reduce? And it helps us enable an efficient use of public resources, because we're saying for every dollar spent, how much risk are we reducing? It helps us promote equity and transparency. And finally, this approach again recognizes that absolute protection is not possible. So then we're led to say, okay, well then what level of risk are we willing to accept? And there are a number of applications. We just showed you, a very large scale application of identifying priorities, but we can also use risk analysis to support decisions or prioritizing around integrated water management planning efforts in California, around floodplain management plans, and land use management below dams. Risk analysis could be used to support Central Valley flood protection planning and a number of its programs. It could support small communities' flood risk reduction. It can help us also address the vegetation on levees issues. For example, how much risk are we going to reduce by spending X million dollars of removing vegetation, and is that more or less effective than other options, and what are the trade-offs? We can use it to inform how we may adapt to sea level rise, looking at capital improvement planning, and finally use it in hazard mitigation planning. So that's what we have for you today. I want to say thank you very much.